The last year has seen the triumph of both global partnerships to tackle the pandemic, Oxford AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute, to name just one. We've also seen some tremendously nationalistic behavior as countries have vaccinated themselves first before helping those in need. Let's now get the view of the MP for Thiruvananthapuram, writer, former Under-Secretary General of the UN, Dr Shashi Tharoor. Welcome, so nice to see you again.
Very good to see you, Edie. I gather you've been busy all day with this conference.
It's been a good day, and this is day two. So first of all, let's give the world a grade, A to F, in terms of how you think we've responded to the pandemic. How has the international community tackled it?
Well, I think it depends on when you do the grading. If you looked at 2020, I'd probably give it as close to an F as you could possibly manage. It really was a disaster. I'd say in 2021 we're doing better, but still between a sort of C plus and a B minus. We aren't anywhere near where we should be. But the fact is that I suppose we're all learning as we go along. Last year we did everything wrong at all levels, and this year we seem to have realized the importance of getting some of it right.
And what are we getting right?
Well, let me take you back to the beginning of the crisis. Had global governance been working effectively, the world would have identified the coronavirus as soon as it emerged, sounded a global alarm earlier about its dangers, identified and publicized the best practices that should have been adopted by all countries to prevent or limit its spread, and then got cracking together in a united manner. This did not happen. In a damning indictment of the state of our new world disorder, we had finger pointing at China and China ducking blame. We had Mr. Trump pulling the United States out of the World Health Organization. We had a shambolic series of different measures being taken by different countries at different times, all of which suggest that we didn't get our act together. Now, this year, there seemed to be some positive straws in the wind. Given the sheer complexity and immeasurability of our interdependence, I think people woke up and said, we really got to do something. We did see by the end of 2020 a lot of vaccine nationalism, with countries scrambling to corner vaccine supplies for their own people, just as in March and April of 2020, they'd all scrambled to sort of ensure that all the pharmaceuticals they needed for their own people had been cornered for themselves. So you've seen a repetition of some of the bad behaviors. But then this year we had some positive examples of vaccine diplomacy. India, to its credit, was right out there early in the year sending supplies out. Unfortunately, India's neglect of its own people and the need for having adequate vaccine supplies for its own people meant that effort came grinding to a halt. But for a month, we were all able to celebrate India's vaccine Maitri, vaccine friendship campaign. And now you're seeing efforts within the WHO, which the US has happily rejoined, to have a kind of COVAX scheme to get vaccines out to countries that don't have any. Now, this is still an idea. It hasn't actually translated into reality, but some progress is being made, and the intentions, at least, are the right ones. There's no point, for example, in Western countries having vaccinated their people if people from other parts of the world who are not vaccinated can still fall sick, encourage further mutations of the virus, and spread new strains to the countries that think they're protected. I think none of us is protected as long as some of us are not protected. And that's something we're going to have to do together. So this is really a period when the importance of multilateral cooperation, of global governance, as we like to call it, really can't be emphasized enough. And I think that's something we really need to do. And once this is all finally over, whenever that's going to be, the globe has to sit down and learn some lessons about what happened, about how international systems and institutions were found wanting and can be strengthened, and frankly, how they need to be radically reformed as well in order to forestall the next pandemic crisis. I don't think we can afford to imagine that COVID is going to be the last such experience. There will be other contagions, and we really have to get our act together better than we did in 2020.
Let's talk about some of those radical reforms of multilateral organizations. You know, the WHO it does an amazing job in a lot of areas. It is also famously under-resourced. What would you change in order to help the WHO, help the world respond to the next pandemic?
Well, I'd say the WHO has done exactly what it was designed to do, the way in which it was designed to do it. All the UN system organizations, and I say this as an unabashed multilateralist, I'm not a UN basher, but all the UN system organizations were designed by the powerful governments of the world to ensure that they would heed the dictates of the powerful. And therefore, there is no question that when China first prevented a WHO delegation from traveling to Wuhan early in the new year of 2020, when the first reports about the virus came out, that the UN system permits a powerful country like China to do exactly that. The bargain within the UN system has always been we have to give enough incentives to the big countries to stay involved, to stay engaged, so we won't do anything to harm their interests. And at the same time, we'll leverage what they have to offer to help the rest of the world. Now, that works when all the big, powerful countries are of one mind and have and continue to maintain an altruistic spirit towards the rest of the world. But when, as happened in 2020, one big, powerful country was seen as the source of the problem and was anxious, it seemed, to wall itself off from accusations and criticism that it had generated this virus. And on the other hand, another big power said, you people aren't doing enough, we're going to pull out, we're going to cut our funding to you, and so on. Obviously, the organization was hammered from both sides. And I don't find it reasonable for us to blame the WHO as if it's an abstraction independent of the member states that have created it and run it. All the UN agencies are created by the 193 member states of the United Nations, and in particular by the 5 powerful players whom we know as the permanent members of the Security Council. And there will be no reform unless they're prepared to forego some of their authority, some of their privileges. I remember a great speech by President Harry Truman when the San Francisco conference took place in 1945 at the end of the World War to create the UN. And he said that no organization like this can succeed unless the big powerful countries give up the rights to do exactly as they please. Well, he was an idealist. None of his successors would want to give up their rights to do exactly what they please. We've seen that in Washington, and we're seeing that in Beijing today. We've seen it in Moscow at other times. So my concern remains that whatever reform we talk about is meaningless unless it's reform that these powerful countries are prepared to sign on to, and if they're prepared to sacrifice some of their clout in order to promote the collective interest of all of humanity.
Is there a way around this? I remember I spoke to Dr. S.J. Shankar together with Tony Blair. Tony Blair said, listen, when I was Prime Minister, I spent years trying to see how we could reform the Security Council. It just isn't going to happen. You should give up this hope, in fact, was what he was very gently advising. And one other way to think about it is, well, what could we do that's different? What new institutions, what new ways could we create to work together as a globe? Is that a better way to approach it, or should we stick with the institutions that we have?
I think we should stick with the institutions we have, precisely because I'm not sure that the world is capable of getting its act together and creating something better. Again, that sounds cynical, but I've had this same conversation with Tony Blair that you mentioned a couple of years ago in his office in London. And my answer is it's all very well to say that the United Nations Security Council is unreformable, because certainly 25 years of trying and failing would suggest that he's right and that it can't be done. But you have to ask yourself, what are the consequences of not doing it? If, for example, the UN Security Council loses credibility when it makes decisions to impose sanctions, decisions to isolate certain countries, decisions even to impose a military solution on a particular conflict, if it doesn't have credibility because it's not representative, if some powerful players are excluded from the UN Security Council's decisions because they're simply absent, and a solution is thought to be implemented in their neighborhood without their consent, do you think that the Council's credibility and legitimacy will survive? My answer to those who say the Council cannot be reformed and that we should stick with what we've got is that yes, we should stick with what we've got as long as we've got it. But can we continue sticking with it if it fails to work? I reminded Tony Blair in our conversation of what happened when the Libya sanctions began to fray, because African countries, which of course had not been consulted before sanctions were imposed on Libya, with the whole Lockerbie affair. I'm talking about the 1990s when I was still at the UN. The Africans said, "The heck with this. We didn't want these sanctions. We don't agree with it." And I remember Nelson Mandela, as president of South Africa, flying into Tripoli. And that was a wake up call for Britain and other countries that had been stubbornly sticking to the sanctions, that they needed to cut a deal, because nothing is worse for the authority of the Council than sanctions that aren't being observed. What would they do? Would they sanction Mandela's South Africa for violating sanctions against Gaddafi's Libya? Clearly they wouldn't. And so they very quickly concluded a deal with the Libyans to end the sanctions, and the whole Lockerbie issue was closed. But I believe it was principally because they were aware that if they didn't close the issue, the sanctions themselves would lose all credibility. Now, that could happen tomorrow if you're sanctioning a country in Africa without South Africa's consent, if you're sanctioning a country in South Asia with which India, for example, has close relationships, and India has not been consulted before you suddenly embargo trade on them or whatever. There's going to be a problem of significant players on the world stage saying, we will not play along with this because we had no role in deciding it. And that's why the Security Council can only gain from reform, because it will make the Security Council more legitimate by being more representative.
So do you see any signs from the new Biden administration that they're prepared to do this?
Well, the Biden administration is a vast improvement from the multilateral point of view on the Trump administration. It's come back to WHO. It might yet come back to UNESCO, and it may well certainly do things like paying its overdue contributions to the UN, particularly to UN peacekeeping, which the Trump administration was reluctant to do. All of those are plus signs. Will the Biden administration go along with Security Council reform? That's a different question, because even President Obama, who had stood in the Indian Parliament in Delhi and declared his support for India joining the Security Council in a famous speech in which he said, India is not an emerging power, it has already emerged. We recognize that, we want to see you with the Security Council. The US administration under President Obama didn't lift a finger to actually deliver on that rhetoric. So we have to ask how different President Biden would be. The Americans are not going to agree to any reform that dilutes their powers and their veto rights. Right now, for example, the current French proposal is that we should have a 25-member Security Council, which would include all the so-called G4, the Indians, the Brazilians, Germans, and Japanese as well, plus a few other countries from Africa and elsewhere to bring up the numbers. Now, if you have a 25-member Security Council, can you really have, say, 10 permanent members with the right of veto? Probably not. Would you then say, well, let us say that no individual country will have a veto, but 2 permanent members are required to veto something? The US won't like that, because the US knows that on a number of issues, Israel, for example, the US is alone, and therefore the US wants a singular right of veto. All of these things will have to be hammered up. This is an issue of real politique and not of idealist blueprint drawing. We really will have to see governments sit down together and say, what kind of system are we prepared to live with? So I agree with Tony Blair that until people have come to that point, we should just continue working with what we've got. But no one is saying we mustn't. What everyone is saying is, let's work with it until such time as it turns out to be useless. But we don't know when that time is going to come. And let's not wait for the day it becomes useless, because the world would be in terrible shape if it does.
We've seen in the last year that India is really capable of leadership. We saw from the Serum Institute, from the export of vaccines, even putting aside the fact that India did keep vaccines for itself, quite understandably. Where do you see India as that rising power, that emerged power, as Obama put it, and what role do you think it can play in rejuvenating multilateralism?
Oh, it can play a significant role by being a power that is anchored in the developing world. I think the my friend Samir Saran and I wrote a book which we've talked about, ED, last year, called The New World Disorder, in which we argued that India could likely be the world's first development power. In other words, that India's rise would be linked not to military muscle so much as to its ability to provide governance solutions to the development needs of millions of people from Asia and Africa. And that, I think, is still India's significant selling point. There's also inevitably, of course, India's own capacities to offer the rest of the world, whether it's the fact that from cyberspace to outer space, we actually have the technology, the human resources, the skills, and the ability to be a world leader and therefore to share with the rest of the world our capacities in these areas. So, global governance in the broadest sense, it seems to me, is a natural field for India to be involved in. Instead of a world dangerously slipping into rival spheres of influence or exclusive arrangements, the kind of world that the UN was set up as an answer to, we should be moving to a world where we're not limited in our ability to respond effectively to global challenges, but we have to be able to navigate the ideological and political diversity of the world comfortably, and that's something we can as India, and in many ways we've demonstrated a capacity to through the vaccine diplomacy that I spoke about earlier. And I actually wrote an article at the time. I'm a member of the opposition, so I have no interest in applauding the government, except when I really agree with what they're doing. I've said that our vaccine diplomacy has actually given India a significant breakthrough in pursuing its aspirations to be recognized as a global power. That is, that in combating COVID, it has to go beyond looking after just its own people to a stage at which it actually has to be able to credibly answer the question that we have done more to save a world reeling from the onslaught of this deadly pathogen than many other countries. And grateful governments will give us the recognition we want. We don't have to clamor for it, as Prime Minister Modi unwisely did at Davos, that we had actually saved the we hadn't, and India's living with the consequences of that. So I think the short answer is if we can continue to speak for the developing world, if we can continue to show that we have a sensitivity to the needs of other developing countries and can not just be a voice for them, as we have been for a long time, but an actual agent of their development and progress. And if at the same time we can also ensure that we act in a way that shows a consciousness of responsibilities beyond our own borders, then I think we could get there. Now, as I said, the problem, and I said this even in the same article that I praised the Vaccine Maitri campaign, the problem was we were at the same time lagging behind our own target of immunizing people in our country. And therefore, at a time of mounting concern about new coronavirus cases and the onset of new variants, which existing vaccines couldn't tackle, as well as an economy which, unlike China's, is not yet back on track, India had a real problem in figuring out how to fulfill its obligations to its own people while ensuring that its obligations to other developing countries was met. And I have to say, we got it wrong. We did a month or so of various exports, discovered the government hadn't ordered enough vaccine. People scrambled right to had to stop the exports to the country. So we ended up losing out on both counts. But again, lessons can be learned. And I would say that India should pay very close attention to both what we did right and what we did wrong in this period, so that the next time around we will be better equipped to do the right thing as an aspiring global power.
I want to get your take on the latest wolf warrior comments from China. Yesterday, President Xi said, Chinese people will never allow any foreign forces to bully, coerce, and enslave us. This is, of course, the English translation that I was reading. Whoever attempts that will surely break their heads on the steel Great Wall, built with the blood and flesh of 1.4 billion Chinese people. I wonder what you take of this saber rattling, looking at it from your perspective in India?
Well, we take it very seriously, Edie. Don't forget that we're just over the first anniversary of a tragic incident of Chinese aggression on our snowy Himalayan frontier, in which 20 Indian soldiers were killed. So this is not a small matter. It doesn't happen every day. In fact, the border has been fairly tranquil for half a century, and then suddenly the Chinese come out, move into territory that previously both sides had been routinely patrolling and withdrawing from, a kind of buffer zone between the two countries, establish permanent positions there, and then when our soldiers go to ask them politely to leave, they're killed. I mean, this is not a small matter. So wolf warrior diplomacy in the Indian experience has gone beyond Chinese rhetoric and saber rattling to actual saber thrusting, and that's not something we can afford to take lightly. Having said that, it is very interesting. It's very clear that under President Xi Jinping, there is now a transition from the bide your time approach under Deng Xiaoping, who wanted China to grow and prosper and become strong and wealthy, but keep its head down. And that was a wise strategy the Chinese followed for about 20, 25 years, where a country whose GDP was about the same as India's to something that is 5 times or 6 times India's, that is well on the way to rivaling the United States, that has become a hugely prosperous power and has also a significant military power with global superpower capacities very much on the anvil. So China has transformed itself, and now President Xi thinks it's time to no longer keep the head low. I think that it's time, so the Chinese diplomats are suggesting, to puff your chest out and speak as bluntly as you believe you are strong enough to get away with. And in so doing, they have naturally raised both hackles and suspicions and worries in different countries around the world. Because when, strong statements are made by Chinese ambassadors to the countries to which they're accredited, there have been half a dozen examples of that, when Chinese leaders in Beijing or Chinese institutions issue statements which send signals to other countries, when China comes up with the so-called 9-dash line that keeps most of the South China Sea for itself, even though many countries have territorial waters in that area, when China sends aircraft over Taiwan, when it dismantles the democratic freedoms that Hong Kong was accustomed to, and so on and so forth. We can come up with not one or two, but over a dozen examples of recent wolf warrior behavior in addition to words. I think the rest of the world has to sit up and pay attention. Certainly in India, we'd be foolish to ignore what we've seen happening on our own borders, and we'd be very foolish to not take China seriously when it starts bristling about one thing or another in its own neighborhood. And we are a next door neighbor. I mean, the US and other Western European countries and so on can afford to regard China with some detachment. We can't. We are absolutely next door. They're also our biggest trading partner when it comes to goods. So there's a lot of things at stake for us. We have to think very carefully. I think the old adage, if you want peace, prepare for war, has never been truer than for India. We'd better prepare, not that we ever want a war with China, but we need to be strong enough to discourage any adventurism in being against us, because their language suggests someday they could be quite capable of translating some of that belligerence into more military action across our borders. So we really have to ensure that we bring about peace both through skillful diplomacy and through being adequately shored up to defend ourselves.
So we've only got a minute left, and I'd love to give you the crystal ball and ask you to look a year ahead. What's the theme that you think people aren't talking enough about now that you think will become quite apparent in the next few months?
Well, I think global recovery. I mean, there is a horrifying development that's happened, is that pretty much all the gains that the rest of the world, other than China, had made in pulling people out of poverty have been eroded thanks to the coronavirus. In India alone, the figures are appalling. I'm hearing of over 200 million people, 230 million, so some estimates, have been pushed down below the poverty line. People who just made it to the lower middle class have lost their jobs, lost their opportunities. Coronavirus, the lockdown, the cracking healthcare systems, and the mismanagement by many governments, including our own, of the way in which this disease has been handled, have created a new poverty problem. And I think the world needs to wake up as soon as the pandemic is behind us to how do we get back to the world in which we were gradually looking with realism at the abolition of poverty and giving people decent lives to lead. That is now jeopardized and under threat for the first time in a couple of decades.
Thank you so much for being with us here again at India Global Forum, Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you, Edie. Good talking to you all.
Nice to speak to you.